Welcome, Professor Kostka, and to here. And then our topic today is environmental governance and data technology and digitalizations in China. Right? Let's welcome Professor Kostka.
Thank you, Kevin, for this very nice and kind introduction. I must say I love being back in Hong Kong because my love for China started in Hong Kong because I graduated 20 years ago from the Li Puchong United World College, which is not too far from here. So it's lovely to be back, and thank you for the invitation. So for those people who know my work, I work usually on local government issues and I do field work. What I present today is a little bit different from my usual work. So I will try to look a little bit more at the bigger picture and see what's happened. And if anything is unclear, please interrupt me and we can just clarify anything while we go along. So today I want to talk about this title, Environmental Governance in the Information Age, and Data, Technology and Digitalization. So what does it mean? So there are actually three waves, some people say, in environmental management in China. The first wave is when I started really field work, and that was the very heavy use of what we call command and control instruments. So environmental issues became especially very high on the agenda of leaders in Beijing in early 2000. It started when they realized that energy intensity is not improving, so there were really attempts to think about how can we make the economy more resource efficient. And so what happened is that in the 11th five-year plan, for the first time, China introduced what we call binding environmental targets. And ever since, the use of command and control has increased. So we see, for example, 5 or 6 binding environmental targets in the 11th five-year plan. By the 12th five-year plan, this was already 9, so there are 9 binding environmental targets. And in the current 13th five-year plan, there are 10 environmental targets. So the use of command and control instruments is very common. And it's not only about targets, it's also about having better regulations, better environmental laws, and of course, enforcement. And so there are a lot of attempts to use command and control instruments. But that's, of course, not alone sufficient. And in the last years, we also see more and more use of market-based instruments. Very known to many of you is maybe the use of emissions trading systems, pilots, and in 2017, like the announcement of a small but nationwide ETS system. But there are also other market-based instruments like payment, ecological services for forest coverage, and so on. So that are what we call the second wave. So moving from command and control to also include market-based instruments. And that's what I want to talk today about, is some people suggest there's a third wave or a next generation of environmental governance and management. And this is what we call using more information disclosure, using more technology and open data. So what's happening here is that really the idea is that China tries to really be more open with data and use data for environmental management. And what we mean here with data is not just big data, and I will come to that in a second, but also 3S technologies and also citizens' science and transparency. So that citizens generate data and use this data to demand changes. So this is just a broad overview of what you could call how China has used now more and more a variety of instruments to tackle this very difficult problem of keep growing, but at the same time becoming more research efficient and environmentally friendly. Okay, so let's then start. Research questions that I'm trying to tackle is really, first of all, to what extent does China use data or technology-driven approaches, and how effectively is this for decision-making in environmental governance? And second, what opportunities and challenges emerge through these new forms of governance mechanisms, both at the national and at the local level? The method, at the moment, this is ongoing, and I'm actually applying for a grant, so your feedback will be much appreciated. And also, so at the moment it's based on documents, both national and local documents from the different provinces, and 11 interviews which were conducted last and this year. And I especially try to look at 3 case studies at the moment. This is Guizhou, Shenzhen, and Shanghai. But this might be expanded and will be, as this research develops further. And any suggestions here would be very much appreciated. So to start with, just China has been using technologies for many years. So it's like 3 S technologies have been used. And with 3S, I really mean remote sensing, geographic information systems, and global positioning systems. And if you see, so these kind of technologies have been used for air quality management, forest coverage, and also to track landscape changes, just to give you some examples. And there has been a lot of learning in that area. And so if you look at the literature, you can really see that the analysis really shows that these kind of new forms of monitoring and also managing have opened new doors for environmental management. So just to give you one more example of how much money is being put into these systems, China is now expanding a lot in the satellite program. So they're really high and ambitious plans for high-resolution Earth observation satellites. Since 2013, there have been 14 satellites installed or planned to be installed with launch time till 2020. And these satellites then are used for monitoring landscapes and atmosphere, and also some of them are with greenhouse gas detectors. One of the latest is the Chinese Gaofen 3, a remote sending satellite. You can see it here. It has a large radar antenna that's 15 meters long, and this kind of satellite is able to really imagine the Earth's surface in all weather conditions. And this can then be used to track really changes in landscapes. And this is really operated by the Chinese Academy of Space Technology. I mean, this is just an example of many of things that are really advancing fast. Another thing where we see some progress is that there's more and more what we call cross-border big data environmental protection cooperation, and it's called the Digital Belt and Road Program. So this program is really a science and technology partnership for the optimal use, again, of big Earth data. And the idea is really to foster sustainable development in the Belt and Road region. At the moment, 19 countries are joining, as well as 7 international organizations. The Chinese Academy of Science, CAS, is investing more than 200 million yuan by 2023 to support the Digital Belt and Road Program. And the idea, again, is to have one open platform with shared data for big Earth. It sounds very easy, but actually to really get all the different technologies and create one platform across countries is a very difficult task. And but it's they're really now quite high ambitions for this project. So now I've used this word big data a lot, and China does actually really push a lot these big data applications. So when we talk about the big data, really what we mean that you take data from multiple sources to make better decisions. And the 4 V's, there are also some people say there are 5 V's, but let's stick to 4. And one is basically you have high volume, so they're really just huge amount of data that is generated. Just to give you an example, Facebook is storing 250 billion images and 2.5 trillion posts. The second V stands for velocity, and it's really the speed at which data is processed to generate insights. So Facebook users, again, upload more than 900 million photos a day. And these are huge amount of data. The third is variety. So there, big data usually refers to also diversity of data. So a diversity of environmental data, let's say air pollution data, as well as maybe traffic data, which is all combined. And fourth, there's veracity, and that refers to the accuracy and quality of data. So this is a little bit just background, the big data. And I'm saying it because actually what we talk in the following, it's not all big data, what is called big data. But it doesn't actually matter, because the point is simply that a lot of advanced technologies are used, and there is more and more open data approaches that help environmental governance, so some argue. But we will get to it, because some argue more data alone is not enough, because you obviously need to actually do something with this raw data. And actually this data really needs to feed into decision-making processes. But I come to that in a second again. So what's China's plan for environmental governance and big data? So in 2016, China, the MEP, now Ministry of Ecology and Environment, announced the construction of one national ecological big data platform. And the goals really were to combine all these different big data sets by 2021. So the intended results in the plan were to modernize China's environmental governance system, and also to create reliable data and models for effective scientific decision-making mechanisms. And I always smile a little bit, because it sounds so easy, right? You have the data, and then this data allows you to make scientific decision-making mechanisms. But everyone who knows China knows also that decision-making is often not data-driven in China. And so if this really will be the result, not only you need data platforms, you also would need a very different way of policy cycles, decision-making processes. We can discuss that in the Q&A. But I just want to also maybe point out two additional, maybe intended or unintended results. And one is for sure, I mean, the MEP always was struggling in terms of power in comparison to other more powerful bureaucracies in Beijing, right? Like the NDRC and so on. So the MEP or MEE now, they will actually be able to use this data and use this increased transparency also as a tool to pressure other agencies in Beijing. So having this more advanced data maybe also increases the, let's say, the political maneuver room from the Ministry of Environment. And another possible side effect is also, it could also help to address this long-going information asymmetry problem that China is facing. And that is, decisions are made in Beijing, but actually actions happen at the local level, but Beijing often doesn't know what happens at the local level, right? So this information asymmetry might be addressed by these kind of more big data approaches, because Beijing simply has more information available of what's happening at the local ground. And it's maybe not surprised that all these big data efforts are now really getting a push under Xi Jinping and his anti-corruption campaigns. I think it's also follows very much the same logic to really increase information, and this makes it also harder for local officials to play the Wild West in their regions when it comes to environmental goods. So that's the national plan. So here you can see a little bit more some details. So in the plan there's always this talk about one ideology, so it's the ecological big data management ideology, and then the three platforms. The first is simply a big data cloud, so you need to first really create the IT infrastructure, which by no means is a simple task. Second, you need a big data management platform, actually then the platform that collects the data and analyzes the data. And then you have the big data application platform, which refers to business applications, and in integrated services for applications. So these are the three platforms we see. So again, develop infrastructure, centralize data management, and here really merging different data sources together. And I talked to people actually at the MEP, and merging different data sources, as you can imagine, is a big headache. Alone for air pollution, they have 3 different data sets, and it's almost impossible. And of course, then try to apply these large data sets. At the moment, we have different pilots in Guizhou, Jilin, Jiangsu, Inner Mongolia, Wuhan, and Shaoxing. And actually, here a lot more research could be done. I haven't seen really good research studying these pilots. So if you're a master thesis student thinking of a master thesis topic, maybe pick a pilot and let us know how advanced they are. So what are the progress at the moment? And first we have to say that it varies across environmental issues. So air pollution is, as you can maybe see, more advanced. So there we have much more data-based analysis and predictive models already in place. So for example, the MEE has a very good air pollution data platform that serves as an early warning system for severe smoke incidents. But when it comes to water and soil, the data provision investments are much lower. Actually, Angel Hsu has a great report from Yale Data Driven that summarizes the different sectors and the advancements they have on big data applications. So if you're interested in this cross-sector analysis, maybe have a look at this from 2017. But then I always mention this, but then I always think we have to also keep in mind some of these issues are also issues that all countries struggle, right? So, I mean, it's obviously a little bit easier maybe to have better air quality than maybe soil issues. And also, I think I always smile a bit because we're so critical towards data collection in China. But when actually my research assistant, a Chinese, came to Berlin, she said, "Oh, Genia, what's the PM 2.5 level in Berlin today?" I'm like, "I don't know." And then she contacted the German environmental ministry and said, "I want to know in Berlin, what's the PM 2.5 level?" And they said, "Oh, we don't have that data." So I just always think it's a funny story how, actually China is already quite advanced when it comes to also publicly communicating air pollution data. And I think the German ministry, we had a discussion with them afterwards, and they said, "Oh, well, we don't have many issues on PM 2.5. But then I think if, let's say, this also comes from construction, right, sites and other sources. So I think people, if they want to know the level of PM 2.5 or other pollutants, they should be able to find out. So I think Germany can learn a little bit from China. So what are the main implementation challenges? And I think there's nothing surprising that came up in the interviews. First is really the inconsistency between different sources. And I mean, everyone who knows China, different data is collected by different ministries. And of course, that means the data is very fragmented. It also is at the moment still very unclear who has sometimes the authority to collect the data and who doesn't. So that's the first point on inconsistencies between different sources. The second is simply incomplete and inaccurate data, and also missing data. So for example, like at the moment, they're really even though the MEE has a good air pollution database, it doesn't collect really data on environmental health effects. So that's an example of missing data. And this incomplete and inaccurate data, I mean, this is a lifelong problem. When I used to go to local governments, they always said, "You want to talk to the statistical bureau?" And I'm like, "No, thank you," because the data was often not very accurate. So the same with environmental data. one has to be careful, I mean, to really improve the accuracy, because otherwise we have this problem of garbage in, garbage out. You can do any sexy model, but if the quality is not good. And at the moment there is still room for improvement here. So then there are these technical issues of simply platform integration. The point about the big data lake, which was pointed out by one of my interviewees, was simply, I mean, even if you collect a lot of raw data, it's really unclear how to use it, what to make them. I mean, the satellites, I mean, make millions of, create millions of data points, but you have to really think about how to use it and and how to integrate it into the decision-making process. And finally, of course, data collection in any area these days gives rise to security and data privacy issues. So these are a little bit the challenges. Now let's move to the local level and look at some examples. If you talk about big data, the one case that always pops up now is Guizhou. And that comes as a surprise, of course, to many, because when you think before about Guizhou, you think about poverty and maybe hydro dams if you're in environmental research, but not much else. What you see lately in the big data field is that Guizhou has been developed, or it's branding itself, let's put it this way, as a big data hub or the big data valley in China. And we do see actually that the big firms, Apple, Alibaba, Tencent, have set up data centers there. And what are the drivers? I mean, on the first hand, of course, cheap labor and also available electricity from the hydropower stations, but also really a lot of support from the local government. They gave a lot of financial incentives to these big firms to encourage that they bring their artificial intelligence investments to the province. And what we see now is really a rise of so-called digital towns. And what happens there is really data processing. So it's really using the cheap labor, but it's not very much advanced programming. And that's a little bit of a struggle for the province, because of course they would like to advance a little bit more, but attracting talents to Guizhou is one of the main problems. So in order to address all of these, the province has a leading group for big data, and what they introduced now at local levels is so-called cloud chiefs, yunjiangs, and these yunjiangs come actually from the hejiangs, and anyone who works on environment maybe knows the hejiangs. It's a new instrument that was introduced for cleaning up the rivers in China. And what's the problem with river cleaning is really that it's a cross-border pollution problem. So rivers flow across provinces or across municipalities, and it has been really politically very difficult to achieve this. And what China has been done is to create these hejiangs, and here basically one party chief, usually the party secretary of the province, was in charge to clean up different, like let's say a river that flows through different municipalities. So instead of the government, suddenly this kind of task of river cleaning up was sourced to the party organ, the party secretaries. And the idea was simply that individuals, like the party secretaries, have more power and can make different subordinate government do the cleanup. And now for the big data, these yunjiangs are introduced, and they are basically responsible for big data development, but within the region. I will come back and give you an example of this later on. So what happens in Guizhou? First, it really it's one big showcase now for environmental monitoring. So in Guiyang, they set up 120 monitoring stations with real-time monitors. Basically, the idea is to expand this to 266 monitoring stations. So at every corner you have monitors. And these monitors collect really different types, again, variety of environmental sources, so air quality, water, noise levels, and they are immediately made available to the public, so citizens can plan their outdoor trips based upon mobile phone apps. So big data here for just citizens to be accessing more information. But big data is also used for actually managing ecosystems in Guangzhou. So here's the example of, let's call it digitalized grasslands. So here a big data platform was generated to manage the Taohai grassland reserve in the Guizhou southwest. And the entire area was digitalized through creating this big data monitoring and management system, the Grass Sea Cloud. And what does this platform do? I mean, they really collected all sorts of, and not just collected, but also integrated all sorts of environmental data from hydrological, environmental, meteorological, biological data. And again, it's real-time surveillance, and these systems are also managed then by these cloud chiefs, and this goes down to the county level. So you also have cloud chiefs at the county level. But this is, I haven't been there, so this is based on many reports you can find online. It would be, again, very useful for all the master thesis students here in the room to do some field work and see how does it actually work in reality. Then there are, of course, the smart cities. So if you ask people on big data and environment, everyone's like, oh yeah, China is creating many, many smart cities. And one of the better cases is, of course, Shenzhen. It builds up a digital environmental protection integrated platform. And this platform also includes an environmental warning system, and also a digital environmental law enforcement system, and an urban environmental emergency management system. And what's maybe interesting, and what I find mostly interesting is that in order to set up these systems, the local government cooperates with private firms. And just to give you an example of this, like there are all these big, like these data-driven tech firms now popping up to support, and they work with local governments for in this big data area. So AudaQ is a firm that was founded in 2011, founded by overseas Chinese, and it actually is sponsored by the Shenzhen government and Guangdong. And the provincial government sponsors these kind of firms because, again, big data is now for many local governments very much a strategic industry. At the moment, this company grew to up to 200 people staff, and mainly there is technicians, IT staff, and they really work very tightly with the government. So they are, for example, just to give you an example of a project, they have a 10 million government grant to clean and organize the 50 million Shenzhen population data. And why it's interesting is because it means the government doesn't manage and clean and operate the data themselves, but it outsources many of these tasks to private companies. And that has implications. Another very big player when it comes to smart cities is Ant Financial, so like Alibaba, if you want. And Ant Financial signed more than 352 contracts, again with local governments. I mean, the goal is to offer payment and credit scoring services to really adopt the infrastructure for a smart city. And if you look, I mean, Alipay, for example, uses already facial recognition technologies to disperse pensions in Shenzhen. They also have a Alipay and Forest app, and that rewards users for environmentally friendly behavior. So again, we see here local governments working with private companies like and financials, Alibaba. So this is not just one example. I mean, I have started a database where these are just 4 examples, but I looked at the smart cities and tracked of what kind of cooperations we see. So here there's some examples between the MEE and IBM for a forecasting air quality project in 70 Chinese cities, but also MEE works with China Mobile on, again, online air pollution monitoring platform. And then we have some examples of smart cities and how local governments cooperate with Huawei or Tencent here. And why I find this interesting is really there are very different interests between firms and the government. And this is a new actors constellation that raises new important issues surrounding data ownership, data sharing, and data privacy practices. And I think that's very interesting in the future also to observe very closely. Just to give you an example, and actually I borrowed that slide from my friend Shasida Ahmed, who works on social credit, so I should acknowledge her here. But if you look, there are already many examples that show this conflict that arise. And there is this work by Browness and Goodman on algorithmic transparency for the smart city. And they studied decision-making systems and so how to make decisions based on big data with regards to child welfare distributions and teacher evaluations. And what they find is that the city's ignorance of how the data is generated is problematic, because then really the data becomes owned by the companies. And there's also a lack of clarity about whether the data analysis can be made available for public review. And finally, there are really a lot of unclarities about what rights cities have over the information collected in the case when they choose to terminate the contracts with the private companies. So in sum, there are these questions of do these private companies and the relationship with the government create maybe a lock-in also for the government? And do the data generated from citizens' use of these services then become also propriety within a tech firm? And so these are all questions like this potential of lock-in and so on that need to be further analyzed. Now, moving on a little bit, so we talked about how the national government has plans, how there are a lot of great initiatives at the local level. I think I would like to use the last minutes and talk a little bit about some bottom-up elements. I mean, this will come not as a surprise to you, but I just want to mention it because it's part of my final conclusion, is that we also see more and more transparency generated through what we call citizen science, so data that is created from citizens. Here you see this example of, like, there's a lot of monitoring of air pollutions, and cities can now report violations via their mobile phone apps. Also, we see that local EPBs, many of them have started their Weibo accounts, and this allows also citizens to engage and report in case they are unhappy. So this is like also again a bottom-up element. Of course, there's some downsides. These kind of bottom-up elements don't work for all issue areas. They also don't work across regions. There are certain areas where this is more common than others, but it's still a nice additional element. You can also see, and that's I find very interesting, more and more where we see mixed elements. So they're really top-down elements, but they integrate some bottom-up initiatives. And here, the maybe example to illustrate this is the MEE's Black and Smelly Water Initiative. And it's top-down because the MEE sets targets, again, certain clean water targets. But it's bottom-up because there are always applications where citizens are asked to report local instances of water pollution. And then these reports arrive to the local governments, and they're in charge of responding to citizens' complaints and cleanup. And there's actually work on this by Angel Sue also, and she finds this is already quite effective. I mean, but still 60% of the reports are still open, so 60% of the reports raised by the by local citizens are not yet finally dealt with by the local governments. So that is an example of top-down, but also integrating some bottom-up elements. So I'm already at the conclusion slide. So what can we take away from this? One could say that the third wave or next generation of environmental management has started in China. We see ambitious plans at the national level, but there are of course significant coordination and technical challenges during the implementation of them. We also see some efforts at the local level, and some are quite impressive. We see new forms of government-business relations emerging. In a way, they're a bit symbiotic. The government can really rely on the expertise from private enterprises, and the private enterprises can work together with the government. But it's also maybe also an asymmetric relationship, and that also creates problems. We talked about the maybe potential of deadlock in for the government, so they become more and more reliable on the private enterprises. But at the same time, the private enterprises are still below the government. So it's also in a way not, even though it's a win-win relationship, it's not a fully symmetric relationship, because it's clear private enterprises very much depend on the goodwill from the government. And so there are new dependencies created by this relationship and maybe lock-in. And finally, we see an interesting mix of top-down initiatives, but with some bottom-up elements. And on this note, I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you for the very interesting and refreshing talk on Chinese environmental governance. So now it's time for Q&As. Anybody have any questions, feel free to raise them.
Okay, thanks for the presentation. It's very interesting. So my question is, actually, I think there are two key issues about the big data platform in environmental management in China. One is the availability, the other is the reliability. So are there any studies or research to show that there has been improvement on these two issues in China's environmental management data? Thank you.
More work done. And I actually talked to people at the MEE, at their research center, and they're also doing work on it, but they themselves don't have a very good study on it yet. So I think that's, I think it's a fast-changing field. So yeah, but I haven't definitely have not seen a systematic study on how it improved. I mean, there are studies who look at data quality and data manipulation by Stephen Oliver, for example. But these are taking always very, two provinces, a very, a more narrow view. So I think a more big picture analysis is yet to be done, I think.
So I think I have a question, follow-up of Mayu's questions. It's about again, about accuracy. Mm-hmm. And I think actually it's more on the real incentives for local government agencies to disclose, to collect, to disclose and share data. Because information itself could be a great source of power. Mm-hmm. So if I keep my data, then everyone have to knock on my door and then ask for information, so that is a source of authority. So in the traditional model, actually local government agencies, they have a tendency to keep the data for themselves. And then so my question is that, are there any new mechanisms that you see that the central government perhaps are introducing at the local level, so that to kind of ratify this sort of disincentive in the local government agencies? So they really have real reasons to do things in this area.
Data is power, and I mean, it's not only that people were not eager to share the data because they thought they get power, they were also very vulnerable by sharing the data, right? So I think local officials, if they could, they would really rather give inaccurate data than the real data. So they usually had 3 data books. right? That's not uncommon in China. So the one which we give to the provincial government, the one which we give to maybe to our government, and one for our own bureaucracy. So they're really different data sets. I think that I think generally my feeling is data reporting has improved quite a lot over the years, and like I just know a lot about energy intensity, and when you just look at energy intensity data in 2005, it was ridiculous what kind of data was reported there. So at the local level they would report, like how much electricity companies used, but that's not energy intensity. And now actually the data that is reported is really of much higher quality. And there are a couple of reasons in general why data reporting improved. I mean, first, there has been more training, and there has been much more information on these matters. And also, there are a lot of more sticks now. And sticks really, it used to be that no official would be punished for manipulating environmental data, right? Everyone would just be, okay, smile, and let's report better figures next time. Now we see, for example, in Hebei, I forgot the number, but a dozen of government officials were really punished severely because they manipulated environmental data. And that is, of course, a signaling. If you punish a few, all the other officials observe this. And so there is now a really awareness among local officials that you get actually punished. Yeah, so either you get not promoted this year, and I think that has really been a change to, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago. And finally, it's not just, because there's always, if you can get away, you will try to manipulate. But I think it's getting harder and harder to get away with certain data manipulation. And one reason is simply that the national government sends more and more inspection teams down to the provinces. And there are different rounds of inspection visits now, and so it becomes harder and harder for local officials to, you can still fool inspection teams, but it's getting harder and harder. And so this combination of there are more inspections, there are more sticks, and there has simply been more training, has to some extent improved the data. It doesn't mean the data is perfect, and if you ask some MEE officials, they tell you it's a nightmare because they get different data sets on the same issue, and they need to integrate them, and then also there's some time lag. Suddenly, one province sends their data set to the MEE, and there's simply the data reporting suddenly stops, and then they have to ask, please, can you send us a complete timeline, and so it's a work in progress.
With regard to the new form of government business partnership emerge, and particularly this is the case for smart cities areas, because you have big players like Tencent, Alibaba, and Baidu, and others. So I guess they have very sophisticated platforms, and then they accumulate a lot of data from different sources. And then I just wonder to what extent the government can tell them or force them or ask them to disclose the data they have, or what would be their strategy of the government to deal with all this kind of data maintained by big companies?
Yeah, this is, I was just in May at the China Internet Conference, and that was a big question in the room. So how close is the relationship between the big tech firms and the government? And actually no one really knows, right? That's the honest answer. There are some people who argue, for example, the government has these blacklists. So if you, let's say, if you had done some really illegal behavior by the Supreme Court, you're on this blacklist. And some people say that if you're on that blacklist, you can also not use Alibaba's services. So if that is the case, and I just say what I've heard from others, if that is the case, then there must be some data sharing between these two players. But no one really knows. I mean, what I can tell you is a little bit that, Alibaba or Ant Financials also runs this Sesame credit system, And what Ant Financials did is that they automatically integrated that app to all the Alibaba clients. And then the government actually responded and says, you cannot automatically integrate this app because it violates privacy rights. And then all that happened is Alibaba stopped this automatic integration, did the public apology. So to me it sounds a little bit right now, it's quite a cooperative relationship still. But this can of course change, and it's a very thin line that both sides are playing. And I think when you look at the social credit system that is currently developed, initially the government gave 8 licenses to private companies, or not licenses, let's say like permission to conduct a pilot. I think that was in 2015. In 2018, none of these 8 companies actually got this license. So what happened is that the government was like, we maybe don't give this to these private enterprises, but they created a union, like Beihang, and in that union it's basically the government and these 8 enterprises together. But what it shows is that the government didn't trust the private enterprises to run these sesame credits, these social credit systems on their own. They still feel it needs to be state-led. And so I have this feeling it's the government is very aware that these tech firms are hard to control. If you look at the US, right, let's say Facebook or Google, and so they want to avoid some mistakes that maybe as being done elsewhere, and so they try to control this relationship a bit. So keep them on a tight leash.
I think one of the very interesting perspective of your research is about big data and the emerging government, business, and society relationship. And then you talk about that citizen science initiatives which have been emerging. And then I think that is very interesting because in a way that the public, they do have their own ways to create information which could be very useful. But there is also a very fine line between anti-government initiative and this sort of, which could be perceived as a positive public inputs. So I just wondered, do you have any observations on that? How things are being developed at this moment?
Yeah, I mean these citizens initiatives, I also sometimes think they're problematic because if you talk to local officials, they complain they get far too many complaints about nothing. Because if you actually study these complaints, I think Angel Sue has data on it, more than half is just on noise complaints, right? And for local officials, they have really like very few people, lots of tasks, and to deal with all these citizen complaints that come in is also at times challenging. And some of these complaints are really very about topics that are not important or turn out to be false, right? A citizen sees some things that's a bit dirt in the air, but it might not be dirt in the air. So it takes also away capacity from the government, these systems. I also find it's very hard for citizens, of course, also to be like inclusive of all different types of pollution. So again, it is a bit one-sided. But I think what has done still a good job. I mean, if you see, it still creates also a communication, and I think that's what is quite important to allow citizens to report environmental accidents to the local government and feel they have a channel to report it. And it's also about trust. So when you look at citizens' science projects, those areas where people trust the local government, then it works a lot much better than in areas where there's not this trust between citizens and local governments. Whether it's anti-government, was it the question?
When the local groups, they are too good in producing their own set of data and then they can challenge the government. That your assumption is wrong. And then
I mean, we see it in a lot of protests, for example, right? And the protesters create a lot of data to pressure the government. I mean, I think right now it's harder and harder for citizens to collect their own data. So this has been, a lot of NGOs were restricted, they can't collect their own data anymore. So this channel is getting a bit narrow. But I think still it's a good way of communicating if the citizens are reasonable. You need to probably depends from issue area to issue area.
The issue that this data or new technology, to what extent that is for the better governance or for better control.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is a big issue here.
Yeah. This is really the main question, is it for control or better governance? And I do think that Beijing also sees it as a measure to control better the localities. When it comes to the environmental field, that's also in the interest of everyone, right? One could argue. Of course, the question is, this big data transforms to many different areas, not just the environment. So I think that's, facial recognition and moving, tracking everyone's movements. So that is a method of social control, social management, and there's a lot of work that's been done, a lot also by Western scholars. Just to give you an example, so the Western media really reports very negatively about the social credit system. Yeah, so they say, the Chinese government totally controls everyone, and China is such a bad country. And I actually on Monday published a survey on this, my survey results, because I just asked 2,000 Chinese people, what do you think about it? And it was really interesting because 80% of the respondents had high acceptance or some acceptance for the system. And this is quite a shock, but then you actually asked, we did interviews, and in the survey we asked, so what is the social credit system for you? And the function for many is to improve life quality. You can you get lots of benefits, bike share deposits for bike sharing services and so on. And also, and I think this was the main perception, is that it addresses regulatory and institutional problems. So if you look over the last 40 years, China does not have a very advanced legal system. There are a lot of regulatory issues, like food safety issues, like I just said, the milk scandal. So people actually appreciated their commercial pilots and the government pilots, but what it allows them is to really check, if a business company, their rating, and it allows them to get additional information. So this was surprising, and we did interviews also to check whether these survey results were true. It doesn't mean Chinese don't care about privacy. It doesn't mean they want to be controlled. But what it means is, for the social credit system, there are also some positive elements. And so one cannot just perceive everything as, like the government controls everything. And so I think it's a mix. One has to really address these issues about who owns the data, what's done with the data. How can we make sure privacy concerns are really addressed and solved? But with the big data and environmental governance, that's also an opportunity. Yeah? So it is an opportunity to improve environmental governance in China.
But you think privacy is really a concern for the government?
Not for the government, but for the citizens. And if it's for the citizens' concern, it's might become, it needs to be addressed. There's a reason why Beijing told Alibaba, take consumers' concerns about privacy seriously and stop automatically integrating the Sesame app into citizens' app, because they do also care about privacy.
Thank you for the presentation. So it's great to hear how big data will actually play an important role in the future for China. But also, I have a question in relation to how the public would actually understand the data itself. It's great to hear how the public will actually have access to, let's say, air pollution data, weather data, for example. But data itself would be pretty much useless if the public has no understanding of the data or understanding of why the data is important. My question would be, do you have any observations on how the government attempts to communicate with the public about how to understand this data, or if not, do you have any suggestions to, let's say, related officials or government officials about such?
This can be done. Again, there's a lot of research actually by IT people now how to make this visualize and make these data more visible also to citizens. I'm not. I don't know yet the government plans on this issue. But I think the key is, and I mentioned this earlier, that just the raw data doesn't mean anything, right? It's about how to cut it, how to use it, and that again is also political, right? There's also like this entire discussion about algorithm transparency, yeah, explainable AI. Like you have to be able to explain it, and it gets so complex that citizens or even science, like very knowledgeable people, can't explain it anymore. Yeah, so that's why we have in the US or in Germany, we have a lot of NGOs emerging. Algorithm Watch as an example, to address these concerns also. Not just how the government uses data to communicate with citizens, but also to make sure citizens understand how the data is generated. It will be interesting in China to see, because there's of course less room for maneuver for NGOs. Maybe the government takes on some of these tasks, yeah, to explain these data sets and algorithms, and I think that would be very interesting to observe.
Also, a great job that you mentioned installing lots of sensors. I wonder what's the level of trust on the public on that kind of data, because people knows that elsewhere in Beijing, for example, the data are not very. Let's just say doesn't connect to reality. So, what do you think of that in Guizhou?
I did not talk to people there, so I cannot answer it. I would be interested to learn about this too. Yeah.
But do you know how do they choose to locate the sensors? Because they might just install it at nice places.
I mean, that's a traditional, right, method. You put the sensors next to the one lake in the city, and then you get good results. I mean, I just think 266 sensors are quite a lot. So one would hope that it's not just 266 sensors around one lake. But yeah, I think this one would have to go there and see.
Hey, any more questions? All right, you are all happy, then that's the end of today's seminar. Let's thanks Genia again
Thank
for
you.
the talk.